I think that song got me excited because it was saying Jesus knows just what we need, and that's what this lesson is all about this morning. It's about our Lord who knows just what we need. And this passage from Isaiah chapter 9 is prophetic of the one who would be all of these things. But what's the first thing Isaiah calls Jesus here? Wonderful Counselor. Have you ever needed counsel? Amen. Several times. And I'm glad to have had wise people to go to find that counsel. But there's no one wiser or more able to give wonderful counseling than Jesus. I don't know if you've checked into it, perhaps you have, but if you want to go see a professional counselor these days, it's going to cost you a minimum of about $75 a session. You know, $75 will buy you an awful good Bible. And that's where the best counseling is to be found. And what I would like for us to do this morning is just kind of peruse just the Sermon on the Mount and see what Jesus has to say by way of counseling in the Sermon on the Mount. Why do we go to counselors? Well, we've got problems, we've got issues, we've got troubles, and we want somebody to give us some information, some wisdom that will help us do whatever we need to do to find resolution to our troubles. And when you read through the Sermon on the Mount with that kind of an idea in mind, you find, all right, there's some really good stuff here, as we would expect from God. First thing he says is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To me, that translates into lose your pride. Lose your self-sufficiency. This isn't about you and what you know. This is about us coming to God and being filled up by Him. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When you go back to Ecclesiastes, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 that the wise people are going to be found in the house of mourning, and the fools will be in the house of feasting. Now, there's nothing wrong with feasting. Did a little bit of that yesterday. But when that's all we want to do. I remember when I was younger and I had friends and all they talked about was party, 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 party. They were the most miserable people I knew because they never could get enough partying. But what's mourning all about? Mourning is a recognition that there's something wrong. When we're willing to accept that life is not the way it should be, that's when we're able to finally start looking at making some kind of a turnaround, making some kind of an adjustment. You ever had a problem with your car and you just kept saying, oh, it's no big deal. It's just a little noise, just a little noise, just a little noise, just a little louder noise. And then finally you're not driving anymore because your car's quit on you. That little noise is a sign something needs to be paid attention to. And in life, there are so many things we need to pay attention to. And when we are willing to recognize that there are things that are not as they should be, we're willing to mourn and make some correction. That's where Jesus is starting with us here. Blessed are the gentle. The gentle. You appreciate the gentle if you've known the rough. Doctors. Now, I want a doctor that knows what he's doing, but guess what I also want? I want a doctor with a little bit of a bedside manner. I don't want it to hurt. Sometimes we give counsel and we hurt, and God says through His Son, blessed are those who are gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They'll be satisfied. They're not hungering and thirsting for self-fulfillment. They're not hungering and thirsting for whatever they see as right or wrong. They're hungering and thirsting for whatever actually is right or wrong. Have you ever heard this statement? It's not about who is right, it's about what is right. And when we apply that situation to so many of, or that fact, that truth to so many of life's situations, we're going to resolve those pretty quickly if we're looking for what is right instead of who is right. Blessed are the merciful. They'll receive mercy. How can you express mercy? Who doesn't need mercy? Who doesn't have some issues in their life and some problems? And when we encounter people like that, our friends who need some patience, who need some forgiveness, that's what mercy is all about. And Jesus starts this lesson giving us good counsel about interpersonal relationships that make all the difference in the world. A little bit of mercy goes a long way. Blessed are the pure in heart, they'll see God. Do you want your friends to be pure in heart with you? Or do you want them to have ulterior motives? Pureness in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. It's interesting what he says about them. They will be called the sons of God. Peacemakers. Who likes peace? I like peace. I like for things to be quiet. I like for things to go smoothly. But Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who like peace. Blessed are those who appreciate things going smoothly. He says, blessed are those who do what? Those who make peace. Blessed are those who see situations where there is not peace and they do something to make peace happen, to bring it about. I remember when I was a kid, the Vietnam War was going on. Henry Kissinger was always in the news. Anybody remember Henry Kissinger? The irony, this guy, where was he from? He was from Germany. From the country that it seems like had involved more death and destruction in the world than any other country in the world. And here was Henry Kissinger, this German guy, who was going, of all places, where was he going? He's going to Israel. What was he doing? He was making peace. He was working for peace terms. I thought, that's pretty cool. That's what God does with us. He works to make peace. And He did it through the sacrifice of His own Son. And He calls on us at the same time to be peacemakers as well, to follow through with His example. We're just getting started with the Sermon on the Mount. How many of this would be helpful in your life already if you just made some of these applications? And then He says this, blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. What do you want to do when people persecute you and insult you? What do I want to do? I want to respond in kind. I'll show them. Jesus says, here's wise counsel. Here's wonderful counsel, if you will. Don't respond in kind. Don't become like them, but do this. Bless and rejoice. Great is your reward in heaven. When you are persecuted and you return blessing for that persecution, when you count yourself someone who needs to rejoice because your reward in heaven is great. And what's He doing when He says your reward in heaven is great? The world's full of issues and problems, and Jesus is already pointing us beyond this world. He says, yeah, you got trouble here. You need to mourn. You got things to mourn over. Your sound system is really bad. You need to, you've got issues to take care of, but there'll be a time when you don't need that sound system anymore. There'll be a time when you don't live in this world anymore. Your home is in heaven. And so with that in mind, with that guarantee, who couldn't put up with a little trouble here for just a while? If you know vacation's coming, you'll plod on at work. Vacation's coming, we're going, and you fill in the blank with whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go. Your biggest fantasy for vacation, it's not even going to touch what God has prepared for us. So you just keep going, you keep plugging. Great your reward in heaven. And then He says, take some personal responsibility in the next section. Look at 13 through 20. Take some personal responsibility. Who are you? You're the salt of the earth. Who are you? You're the light of the world. Take responsibility for that. Show other people the way. Be salt. Be light. Be somebody that people are glad to be around. Be somebody whose impact is something that's good enough for people to say it was good for us to be around him. Even if you make them uncomfortable with truth, do that, if that's what needs to be done. Sometimes that's what's involved in peacemaking. Take responsibility. Be a city set on a hill. Be someone that people could see from a distance and go, that's where we need to go right there, a city set on a hill. We're going to find something to eat there. We're going to find security there. We're going to find water for ourselves and our animals. We're going to find a place to sleep over the night. That's what a city on the hill meant to travelers in the first century. Be that. Be salt. Be light. Be a city on a hill. Take responsibility not to fall in with what other people are doing. Look at verse 19, or rather verse 20. I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. What's He saying? Here's what we do in life. We look at everybody around us and we go, well, this is how they're behaving. And we gauge our behavior based off of their behavior. And Jesus says, don't do that. You see what the scribes and Pharisees are doing? Don't be like that. Surpass that. There's a higher way to live, a better way to live. This is the wise and wonderful counselor that God gives us that tells us, do not look at what other people are doing and think that that's the way you need to live your life. Be above that. And then He shows us how to be above that in 6 different ways. By the way, do you remember Romans chapter 12? Where Paul writes this, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. How are we going to be transformed? by the renewing of our minds. That's what Paul writes, and that's Jesus' disciple, Jesus' apostle in Romans chapter 12. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. These next 6 points are exactly that. This is Jesus saying, don't be conformed to the thinking of the world. Don't be conformed to the righteousness, if you will, of the scribes and Pharisees, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Think higher, think better. You've heard that it said by the ancients, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you, everyone who's angry with his brother. Is it about murder or is it about anger? Is it about the deed you do to someone or is it about how you hold someone in your heart? That's what Jesus says. Here is wonderful counsel. Think the best thoughts possible about everyone. You're talking about being able to rest at night. When you lay down at night and you put your head on that pillow, does this look like I'm sleeping? I'm laying my head back on my pillow. If your thoughts are about some goofball that injured you that day, if your thoughts are about how you might get back, if your thoughts are about how you're justified to be angry and upset with them, you probably won't sleep too well. But if your thoughts are about how to make peace, and that's what this is all about, what does Jesus say to do if you're angry with your brother? He says, go make peace with him. Go make peace. Peacemakers. We're back to that again. And then in verse 27, what's that about? That's about lust. Don't commit adultery. Is this about adultery or is it about what we do with our eyes, what we do with our mind? I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust in her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, what do? Well, he said, pull it out. He didn't mean that literally, I don't believe. Jesus might correct me on this, but I don't think he literally means pull your right eye out, because where does lust take place? In your eye or in your mind? If it were true literally, then blind people wouldn't have the capacity to lust. I just don't think that's true. It's about the mind, what goes on in your mind. Verse 31, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I'm saying to you, everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery. What's he saying? He's saying be faithful in your relationships. We bring in all the mess of divorce and remarriage. All Jesus is really saying to us here is be faithful in your relationships. You talk about wise counsel. I've talked to people who've had marital problems, and they go to a counselor, and the counselor, who's not counseling from a biblical standpoint, says, you need to divorce that person. I don't really see that in the Scriptures. What I see is Jesus saying, be faithful. Now, he gives a reason for divorce. If there's unfaithfulness, if they've gone and they've slept with somebody else, that's a different situation. You're not obligated to divorce, but you can. But the bottom line is he's saying, be faithful. It's about faithfulness. Verse 33. He's talking about false vows, but is he really talking about vowing, or is he talking about what I think he's talking about, a sense of self-awareness? Where do these false vows come from? Oh, I swear by heaven. Well, wait a minute. Who do you think you are? Swear by heaven. Okay, well, I'll swear by the earth. Wait a minute. Who do you think you are to swear by the earth? All right, well, I'll swear by my own head. Wait a minute. Who do you think you are, Marty? You and your bald head, and you can't do a thing about it. Not only is it bald, but I got this flaky little skin up there, and I just can't seem to get rid of that. You didn't know what you were going to hear in this sermon this morning, did you? You see, but that's what Jesus is talking about. It's not about power in heaven, power on the earth, power over your own head. It's about a sense of self-awareness where we realize I'm pretty small. And if I know I'm small, then I'm going to seek guidance from outside. Because guess what? I'm poor in spirit. See, we're back to that. All this stuff is connected. But if I'm not poor in spirit, if I think I'm going to swear by heaven, then I don't really understand who I am. I'm going to swear by the earth. Well, I still don't understand who I am. I'm going to swear by my own head. Marty, you don't have that kind of power. What should I do? I should say yes when I need to say yes. Say no when I need to say no. That's what I need to do. That's what Jesus says. Self-awareness. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? What's that all about? Revenge? It's exciting, isn't it? Think about getting somebody back. The wonderful counselor says, don't take revenge. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, what do? You turn the left. Does that sound hard to you? You ever gone to a counselor and he tells you what you need to do and you go, I'm not going to do that? You go to a doctor and he says, this is what you need to do. You say, I'm not going to do that. No, you better do it. If they know what they're talking about. Now, worldly counselors and doctors, they may make mistakes, but Jesus doesn't make mistakes. If you want to know what to do, and you call on the Lord and He says, here's what I counsel you to do, then you know it's going to work. It's always going to work. Verse 43, you've heard that it said you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I'm telling you, do what? Love. Love even your enemies. All we're doing is taking a quick walk through the Sermon on the Mount and looking at the very basic counseling, if you will, the very basic guidance, very basic teaching that Jesus is offering here. I don't know about you, but I've known about this sermon for a long time. As a matter of fact, when we were in school, we had to memorize the entire Sermon on the Mount. And you're probably thinking, like I thought then, oh, I could never do that. Just let somebody assign it to you and give you a due date, and you'll get it done. We don't understand our capacity. I think that's counsel that we ought to get more often than we do, that we have a much greater capacity to do good than we think we do. This guy memorized the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, me, Marty Kessler. Gave me a piece of paper. I wrote the whole thing out. I didn't think I could do it until I did it. Don't you know that's the way the devil works all the time? He is counseling us in the very opposite direction. Oh, you can't do that. God said you shouldn't eat that fruit. Well, I'm telling you, you should. Whatever God says, the devil is always telling us the opposite. Whichever direction God leads, the devil is leading in the opposite direction. It always works that way without fail. So right now, as we're hearing these teachings of Jesus, we're saying, well, there's a way around that. There's a loophole. Chapter 6, the first three things in chapter 6, he says, be generous. Cast your bread on the waters. What happens if you cast your bread on the waters according to the Scriptures? It comes back to you after many days. That sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? What good is wet bread? What's he talking about? It's imagery. You take what's valuable to you and you disperse it for the good of others, and it's going to come back to you. There's a passage in Proverbs that I've remembered ever since I read it the first time. It says, when you give to the poor, you lend to the Lord. Think about that. You ever lend something to the Lord? When you give to the poor, you lend to the Lord. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about being generous with others. He's talking about prayer in verse 5. He's talking about fasting in verse 16. Oh, wait, we don't do that. We don't fast. Do a little bit of research on health. You don't have to Google very far. And one of the things you'll find being repeated more and more these days is the benefit of fasting. Just going without food. Now, I don't think it's a physical thing necessarily here in verse 16. I think Jesus is talking about a spiritual benefit of fasting. But here's the way it works. Every time you come to a spiritual benefit in the Scriptures, rest assured there is a physical benefit that goes right along with it. And if there is a spiritual benefit to fasting, there is a physical benefit to fasting. If there's a spiritual benefit to praying, there's a physical benefit to praying. How many of you, like me, have been facing troubles and trials and problems, and you just didn't know how in the world you were going to get through it? You take it to God, and somehow, after the prayer, you just feel relieved. What a burden has been lifted. Now my mind is at peace and at rest. I don't know how that works, but I know it does. It's not going to stop me from doing it, because here's something else I know. I go out in that parking lot, and I put my key in the door, and I turn that lock, and I know there's some tumblers in there, and I'm not exactly sure how that works. Bob could explain it to you, because Bob's a locksmith, but he would have to explain it to me exactly how that works. Then I take that same key, and I put it in the ignition, and I turn that, and not only do those tumblers work, and that ignition turns over, but the car starts up. I don't understand everything that has to do with internal combustion engines. Some stuff, yeah, but not everything. How do your brakes work? Do you have ABS brakes? I hope not. Those are the worst things in the world. Anyway, what about your air conditioner? How does that work? Isn't that cool that you can compress Freon gas and it gets cold and you can run that through some tubes and push air through it and it's air conditioned? And not only is it cool, it's dry. Tell me that's not a gift of God. Can you imagine at the creation, he's saying to Jesus as they're coming up with, just wait till they discover this. They're going to be thanking me left and right for air conditioning. Yeah. It's pretty cool stuff. The way God made the world. It's pretty cool the way God made us. And He designed us to respond to this kind of counsel, to the wisdom of the world. The last part of chapter 6 is all about anxiety. And not really so much about anxiety as priorities, because if you get your priorities right, if you focus on the right stuff, your anxieties are going to be taken care of automatically. That's just the way that works. Look what he says. Verse 19, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What's that mean? What do you focus on in life? Wherever your focus is, that's where your heart's going to be. And that's where you're going to be stuck in the sense of always thinking, always coming back to it. But if we're always coming back to the kingdom of God, which is what he says in verse 33, seek first what? The kingdom of God and his righteousness. That's the only way. If you seek first the kingdom, that's the only way you can be comfortable with storing up treasure in heaven while not storing up treasure on the earth. Now, what's wrong with treasure on the earth? It's good stuff. If God gives you good stuff, then enjoy it. That's what Ecclesiastes says several times in Ecclesiastes. Solomon writes, enjoy your life with the good things God's given and with the woman that God's provided you. Of course, he's talking from the perspective of a man. But when God gives us good things, we should enjoy it, but don't allow those things to become your master. That's what he's saying here in chapter 6. Look at verse 24. No one can serve two masters, priorities. He'll either hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and he'll despise the other. And you cannot serve God and wealth. Wealth is a fantastic servant. Look at the people who use their wealth to serve. It's a fantastic servant, but if you allow wealth to become your master, woe be unto you. This is God's counsel. This is the wonderful counselor leading us in these directions when the folks of this world will lead us in the opposite direction. So he says in verse 25, make God your priority and don't worry about life. He's not saying be irresponsible, but just don't spend your time being anxious about what you're going to wear and what you're going to eat. God is going to take care of you. He knows just exactly what you need. Isn't there a song like that? Something like my God knows or my Jesus knows just what I need. That sounds like a familiar refrain for some reason. Pretty good the way that works, isn't it? And then chapter 7. Don't judge. But man, it's so much fun. It really is, isn't it? Because there's so many goofy people in the world. And you can look around and you can see them being goofy and you can go, let's talk about that guy. Let's talk about her. What did they wear? And look at that. What's going to happen if we live like that? Well, first of all, we're not going to be at peace because the mind's not designed to work that way, to constantly be judging other people. You set yourself up as a judge. You know it's coming back to you, and that's what Jesus says. The way we measure it out is the way it's coming back to us. That's his counsel. The golden rule. You knew that's in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't you? Now there are other kinds of rules. This is verse 12. In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. This is the law and the prophets. There's the iron rule. I think that's what it's called. The iron rule is do unto others before they do it to you. And then there's the wooden rule, do unto others as they do unto you. And I like iron and I like wood. But if you're going to give me something, give me gold. Golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You talk about peace of mind. And then he says in verse 13 to 14, it's going to take some work. This is golden counsel. The golden rule comes with golden counsel. You've got to work at this. It doesn't come naturally and it doesn't come easy. But if you work at it, it's going to pay big benefits. This is the counsel of the wonderful counselor. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are a lot of people going in that way, but there's a small way, a narrow way that leads to life. Few find it. Few find it. Do you want to be one of the few? I do. It's going to take some work because it's not necessarily easy. He's got warnings for us here about the false prophets, about all the things we'll hear that are not good counsel. He says, take heed that you don't listen to that stuff. There are sheep's and wolves' clothing, which is talking about or wolves in sheep's clothing, which is a wolf that you don't necessarily recognize as a wolf right off. You got to make some effort to recognize who and what they are. But how do you say we'd know them? He said, there's a way. Look at their fruit. Look at what they produce. Now, who's the most famous counselor today that you can think of in our world, in our culture? Nobody saying Dr. Phil? Did somebody say Oprah? Dr. Phil. See, we know Dr. Phil. What does Dr. Phil always ask people when they tell him what they're doing? How's that working for you? That's a fantastic question. How's that working for you? That's sort of what Jesus is doing here. Jesus came up with it first. How you going to know a false prophet? Well, you know them by their fruit. What does it produce? How's that working for you? What's coming through that? What's the end result of what you do? And if we follow the counsel of Jesus, I know I've said this before, I'll say it again. Yesterday I turned 62. Now, I didn't say that before. But being 62, all of my life, I grew up in the church. I've known these things since my youth, like Paul said of Timothy. There's never one single time that I've done what the Scriptures taught me to do and thought, oh man, I got to find something better. It always works. It always tends to be better. I can tell you several times when it wasn't easy. I can tell you several times when I did not look forward to it, but I can never point to a time when it didn't work. And who among us doesn't want that kind of counsel? We can be afraid of what's not easy, but we don't have to be afraid of something that won't work, because this works. You want to have your house on a solid foundation? Jesus says, here's wise counsel. Follow what I say. You'll have a solid foundation. You won't have to worry about your house crumbling when the storms come, because the storms will come. He doesn't say if the storms come. He says when the storms come. And when the storms come, if you followed His lead, if you followed His counsel, if you listen to the one who is the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the Prince of Peace, eternal Father, if you listen to Him, you'll be on a solid foundation. That's what I want. We had a house in Tulsa. I don't know if I've ever told you this little story before, but we bought it. It was a really nice house. We loved that house, but it had some foundational problems. And part of it was settling away from the other, and there were these big cracks coming in the wall. And I thought, well, man, we need to move out of this thing. And then I also thought, well, that's no good, because we got to sell this house. We can't sell this house in the condition it's in. So we had to hire some people. And what they did was they came in and they drilled big holes in the floor, and they put these hoses in, and they pumped concrete. I forget what the process is called. Somebody here knows. But they pumped that concrete in there, and they lifted up with big pumps the part of the house that was settling. You know, I didn't want to face that expense. That cost a lot of money. And part of me said, we'll just leave it the way it is. What would have happened if I'd have left it the way it was? I'd say, go to this address in Tulsa, and you'll see a crumble of bricks and mortar that just caved in on itself. Because that's what would have eventually happened. But we talked it over and we decided, yeah, it's worth the expense, let's do it. We did it. It's a great house. You can still go by there and see it today, where we lived in Tulsa, Berry Hill. But you got to do what you know you got to do. And when the wonderful counselor says, here's my counsel, you got to do it. It's not enough to listen. It's not enough to sit at His feet and hear what He's got to say. You got to do what He says to do. This morning, there may be somebody here who knows what they need to do about the gospel. I know Phyllis and I have studied with a young lady friend of hers, and she knows what to do, and we're praying for her that she'll do, but maybe that's you today. Maybe you need to follow the counsel of the wonderful counselor. Maybe you know you need to seek out the prayers of the church. Maybe you know you need reconciliation with someone. Maybe you know there's some issue, some situation where you need to follow God. If that's what the situation is for you this morning, then this song is for you. We call it a song of invitation. All it is a song we sing together, inviting people to respond to whatever you need to respond to in your life. based on the advice of the wonderful Counselor. Let's stand and sing together.